Hi, welcome to Soothing Pod's Sleep Stories. The day is done and you deserve to rest. Make yourself comfortable, let your full weight be supported, and slowly unwind all your muscles. Start where your shoulders meet your neck and soften. Take a long, easy breath and relax your body further. Feel the softness travel down your back, loosening your shoulder blades and releasing your core. Let your breathing move smoothly in and out, and feel the weight of the day set aside. Any worries you have can wait, because here and now, you'll find nothing but peace and the tale of a young man, a precious family recipe, and the special ingredient that brought it all together for him one fateful night. Nick knew how to cook, but he never took the time. Between work and working out, his buddies and his side gigs, Nick had gotten into the bad habit of just grabbing snacks. He thought it was liberating after years of punctual meals with his family. Now he was on his own and almost prided himself on a sparse kitchen. He was young, healthy, single, and not about to admit that cooking for one felt like a difficult, lonely task. He never told anyone how most of his future dreams took place in a warm kitchen, busy with shared laughter, delicious kisses over the fresh ingredients, and something always steaming over. He flipped on his bright fluorescent kitchen light, shut his apartment door behind him, and sighed. After a long work week, Nick always wished for his father's famous lasagna and the fresh-baked breadsticks that his mother braided by hand. As if she knew, Nick's mother called, and he hesitated only a few seconds before answering. There was a clattering and laughter in the background, and his mother's voice was hurried. She had his sisters over, their significant others, and her own kitchen was a whirl with everyone pitching in. Nick leaned on his bare counter and smiled as they all shouted hi. It was just a quick call to let him know how much they were all looking forward to him hosting grandmother's memorial birthday. His mother fretted aloud about him practicing the required family recipe, but then his father burned something on the stove, and she hung up with only a few scattered kissy sounds and I love yous. Nick turned to his neglected wall calendar, hanging on a bent nail against the sleek grey wall, and saw his whole family was coming over on Sunday. There was no way around it, no excuse he could make. They'd been celebrating the same way for the last decade, and more specifically, the last 3 years, when the word memorial had to be added to the special day. He left his coat on as he spun around his small kitchen. Where had he left his grandmother's cookbook? Her birthday was the one agreed upon holiday the entire family held sacred. Plans could change during the crush of other calendar celebrations, but his family had set aside one day in the spring to all come together for her. His grandmother had always been something of a family legend. She was the most quoted, the most toasted, and the most beloved for all the happy memories she had created, and the whole family loved how every year on her birthday she had made mouth-watering fondue for everyone from an old secret family recipe. There were rules set up when Nick's grandmother passed. The recipe would never be distributed. It would remain safe inside her beloved cookbook and be passed to each family member in turn. To follow her directions and make her favorite food was the perfect way to honor her and, in turn, be gifted with her home-cooked wisdom. Much had been made over the past 3 years of the magic that came with cooking grandmother's fonduta. His eldest sister got engaged while setting the table the first memorial year. His middle sister was accepted into her dream doctorate program on the second. His father retired the third memorial year and had been given a surprisingly large bonus just before sitting down to the now fortuitous meal. Nick ransacked every cupboard in his empty kitchen. The cookbook had arrived weeks ago, along with a slew of messages from his sisters, but he had set it aside and forgotten the whole thing. Now, in a cold sweat, Nick finally found the heirloom cookbook lying flat on top of his refrigerator. He gently blew off the dust and then checked his phone. He had 6 new work emails despite the fact that it was Friday. His buddies were all in the same boat, and no one would be out for beers until later. Nick had time to practice the recipe and maybe eat a little better than his normal bachelor diet. He paged carefully through the well-worn cookbook and found the page he recognized from fond memories. It was stained along the lower edge and still marked with a sticker from his favorite childhood cartoon. His sister had drawn a tiny flower on the top of the page, and the corner was dog-eared. There was a receipt from the 90s when his mother had first helped shop for the event, and underneath it was his father's looping handwritten inscription: "Here between the pages is the best recipe ever." Nick didn't read the rest of the cookbook page. Instead, he plucked a yellowed piece of stationery out and unfolded it. There was his grandmother's neat handwriting and every ingredient marked in a tidy shortlist. It was just Italian fondue. How hard could it be? Nick scanned the first few items and then tucked the paper in his coat pocket. He checked it again when he got to the mailboxes by his apartment building's front doors. Under the ingredients list was a short paragraph of instructions, and something else was written on the bottom of the paper that he couldn't make out. Thinking about his grandmother writing it stopped him on the front steps. Nick realized, with a tightening in his gut, that he was holding his grandmother's original recipe, the one that wasn't supposed to leave the cookbook. Now his sister's dire warnings not to lose the recipe made sense. It wasn't printed in a thick book he couldn't possibly misplace forever. Suddenly, the piece of stationery felt thin and too precious to touch. Nick carefully put it back in his pocket, but paused outside his apartment building. He had to reassure himself of his age and good conduct. Clearly, he was responsible enough to hold down a great job and keep a comfortable place. There was no reason he couldn't take the recipe to the grocery store and return with it still safe in his pocket. He marched down his neighborhood sidewalk and over to the busy city street lined with the little shops, restaurants, and bars. It was a lively part of town, just outside the business district, and it was full of young people like Nick who were just starting out, except on the weekends when it was a hotspot for dates and dinners, romantic window shopping, and walking while holding hands. Nick stuffed his hands in his pockets and dodged around people on the sidewalk. The recipe was safe with him. Wasn't his focus proved by how he sacrificed dating in order to build his career? He pulled his eyes off happy couples slipping arm in arm into cozy restaurants and quickened his pace to the grocery store. His family certainly wasn't helping his chances of meeting someone by keeping him at home practicing an old recipe instead of being out flirting at his favorite bar. Although his single status did make things easier in the store, there was a crush of people stopping by on their commute home, and the crowd was compounded by the weather report calling for spring storms all weekend. Everyone wanted to stock up and get home. The air practically crackled with their combined impatience. Nick found it easy to slip alone through the knots of shoppers and grab the items from his grandmother's ingredients list until he got to the cheese. He'd never heard of Bel Paese cheese and couldn't see it anywhere between the bags of shredded mozzarella and the 2 yellow cheese slices. He had to go to the counter in the cheese department, where he saw it stacked in a glass case. A long line had already formed, and Nick was again grateful he was single and had no one waiting for him. In no great hurry, Nick had time to pity the overworked mother trying to herd 3 toddlers away from a large display of marshmallow cereal. He could smirk at the married men with cell phones pressed to their ears as they searched for the exact item their spouses insisted existed but couldn't be seen anywhere. And he was just settling in to a little light eavesdropping on the arguing couple in front of him when he saw her. His ease was gone, but his patience suddenly increased. Nick thought that maybe he could wait all night if he could watch the cheese counter girl grin. It was hurried and a bit tight as she helped her more impatient customers, but the reappearance of that smile kept Nick's eyes on her. She made him feel like smiling too. He watched her quick, graceful work, and once when she had to lean up on tiptoes to reach across the counter, he was able to read that her name tag said Lily. Lily had spotted the young man as soon as he had appeared in her line. Something about the relaxed way he looked around at the other customers and stood so comfortably in line caught her eye. She spied a sharp business suit under his coat, but his ruffled hair made him seem young and still fun. If he was a jeans and t-shirt guy on the weekends, then she could easily find him irresistible, and Lily had to snap her thoughts back to work in surprise. She wasn't looking for anyone to flirt with or to date, especially not a customer. Lily had learned not too long ago that many men didn't appreciate her gourmet training, and she would rather pursue her expertise alone. Hard work was easier than finding love, and she set her eyes back on the many tasks at hand. Then, as she thin-sliced Swiss cheese for a particularly sour customer, Lily saw the young man step out of line to help an elderly woman. The woman pointed up higher than her crooked little back could reach, and he plucked down the box she described. It wasn't right, and he had to try again, and he got it wrong at least twice before the little old woman thanked him and let him return to the cheese counter. The line had extended by 4 customers before he got back, but he didn't seem to mind at all. And when their eyes met, he gave Lily a warm, bright smile. Each customer in between seemed to take an agonizingly long time with their decisions. Lily handed out samples of this and that, recommended pairings, weighed and wrapped a dozen cheeses before the smiling young man was next. By the time it was his turn, her stomach was in a knot and her hands felt hot. She was so nervous, all she could do was smile and stare at him when he stepped up to the counter. Nick's serene wait in line was over, and he'd completely forgotten why he was there. Then Lily gave him an uninterrupted smile, and all he could do was dig through his pockets and try to explain about the recipe. He said too much about his overbearing family, but Lily just laughed and gently plucked the list out of his flustered and still gesturing hands. As simple as it would be for Lily to locate the bel paese and perfect mozzarella, the recipe was interesting, and she read it over a few times. It was probably just warm from his pocket, but Lily could easily imagine cozy gatherings and laughter when she skimmed that old, crinkled piece of paper. Nick noticed her interest, introduced himself, and offered to read his grandmother's writing. Lily didn't need this help, but she admired the graceful cursive one more time and then smoothed the recipe out on the counter between them. Leaning forward to point at the list, she made a few suggestions, while Nick stepped closer to study the items in question. He looked to her for the final decision and didn't look away. The line was building again behind him, and all she could do to prolong their moment was to offer him a sample of Havarti. Nick was famished and popped it into his mouth too quickly. He had no idea how to comment on it, and suddenly their transaction was done. Lily handed him the cheeses for grandmother's fonduta, and the next customer was already speaking to her over his shoulder impatiently. He stepped aside and left. Lily saw him cruise by the cheese counter again a few minutes later, and she suddenly couldn't wait for her shift to be over. She was worried he had disappeared by the time her replacement finally arrived, and Lily was out of her apron so fast she spun around. She was so distracted that she hit the counter when the other worker called her back. Was that recipe hers? Nick had left his grandmother's notes on the counter, and Lily caught it just before it was tossed out. Her hopes soared to dizzying heights again. Maybe she could still find him and save the day. Lily searched the store, but she couldn't catch sight of his ruffled hair or sharp suit. It seemed as if Nick had already moved on. She circled the store one last time and absently gathered the items for fondue to make her pacing appear less suspicious. Her co-worker had already teased her enough for leaving her number in case Nick returned to the counter for his recipe. When the store was out of white truffles, Lily took it as a sign of total defeat. He wasn't coming back to ask her out. Nick was planning to return, but he was down the block and completely lost in his quest for white truffles. The manager at Lily's store had apologized profusely and sent him to the marketplace, but he'd forgotten the landmarks he was supposed to use. Was it between the organic coffee counter and the cured meat stall? Or next to the spice shop and the kiosk of hand-dyed silk? He worried that her shift would be over already, and his pace quickened past the produce stalls. Lily slipped in the back door of the marketplace and went straight to the Italian deli. The pulse-skipping feeling of meeting someone new had faded and her steps dragged. She was quickly getting pulled down by the thought of cooking for herself yet again. The cuddly, fork-sharing couples at the culinary school next door weren't helping, and Lily tucked her head down as she got in line. The bright chatter of the culinary school finally called Nick's attention to the correct corner of the marketplace, and he rushed over to the deli counter. There, he could barely swallow his frustration when he saw the long line. Why couldn't his grandmother's recipe just use regular black truffles? Why couldn't he have found everything at Lily's store? It was her store now, in his mind, and he already had a half-dozen reasons to return in the hopes of running into her again, if only he wasn't stuck in another line. The young woman in front of him glanced around to investigate his growling, and her guarded expression broke into a surprised grin. That smile up close, no counter between them, stole Nick's breath, and all he could do was stammer about truffles. He patted his pockets, and his eyes widened when he realized the recipe was gone. Since he'd met her at the cheese counter, Nick had forgotten all his plans. His procrastinated recipe practice, meeting up with his buddies, even his family's impending visit, had all flown out of his head. But now that she was there in front of him, he couldn't postpone his search. He had to leave her again. That scrap of paper was the soul of his family's tradition. And it was in Lily's hand. She held up his grandmother's missing recipe and confessed to wanting to try it herself. Nick was happier to hear she'd left her number for him just in case, but he still took the faded paper with relieved reverence. Maybe there really was some magic in making his grandmother's favorite food. They looked over the recipe again together, and it was Lily that transcribed the final secret ingredient to the magical fondue. And, as always, a little dash of love and luck from your grandmother. Now, go ahead into your own delicious dreams and know that love and luck will be yours tomorrow as well. Sleep well, and I'll tell you another story tomorrow on Soothing Pod.